Hey everybody, I have another video here in Ancient America here for you today. And this is one that I've been reading on for a few weeks, and it's my home state. I've had a few questions and comments recently, so a good time to talk about this one. But first of all, I've had some questions on Matt's video yesterday. Quite a few of them, a few messages sent to me. What do I think about this? Do I agree with it? Well, what do you think? And I just think the only thing to do is just have a live debate on this subject. And Matt says the Sphinx was not Anubis, and he capitalizes it, so we have briefly discussed it, and I think we should just have a debate on whether it was Anubis or a lion. And I have had people comment on my videos, and I said, well, put your money where your mouth is, and let's talk about it. And everybody has taken the cowardly way out and just not done it. I think the best thing to do is have a discussion where all the evidence, what the Egyptians tell us the history was, just have all the evidence presented and let the audience decide, is it Anubis or is it a lion? Now, I've had people say, well, I'm not going to debate you because you won't be nice. Well, I didn't know they gave away a congeniality award for debates. A debate to me is just two sides showing opposite stories and the audience deciding which one has the best evidence. So that's all I will try to do. Try to prove my story and debunk the other side in the most quick, effective way I can, in the most clearest way I can. So I hope Matt isn't like all the others and debates me. But getting back to the video here, let's get down into Indian Mounds Park. Just take a peek around and do a little reading. But here we are down along the river, and these mounds are preserved pretty well nowadays. But there was mounds taken out and some big ones, and this is what remains today. Now here are some pics I wanted to show you. This comes from 1957. This is a map done by Neldon Johnson, and this is published in the Science Museum of St. Paul. Here is a pic from 1910 showing the mounds here. Here is a pic dated 1905 coming from the Minnesota Historical Society. And then here is a pic dated 1960. Now this was a pretty good article, I thought, and I'm going to read here, but it says, what is known about the Indian mounds? Today there are 6 remaining Indian mounds found on both sides of the current pavilion. At one time there were 39 found in 2 separate areas along the bluff, but they were destroyed by early farming, houses, and park development. These burial sites have been researched, photographed, and written about extensively. However, there are still many unanswered questions about their origin and significance. There is an informational plaque behind the pavilion, but it is filled with questionable assumptions. The information contained here includes some confirmed facts as well as a few uncertain statements. One of the first questions to ask might be, when were they built? No one knows for sure. An educated guess would be they were constructed probably a few at a time between 200 BC and 400 AD. They are certainly the oldest remaining examples of human works in St. Paul. Many scholars see them as part of what they call the Hopewell culture, a concept that includes the beliefs and practices of Native American peoples who built mounds in many areas of the country. And once again, the Hopewell, that comes from that area of Ohio and Pennsylvania and West Virginia. Mainly Ohio, I believe. The Hopewell thing comes from. And the Newark earthworks especially. And I will be talking about those in the future. I've had comments and questions on those. But it seems some historians are, saying this is the Hopewell culture in St. Paul, Minnesota, quite a distance from Ohio in that area. It says, another query, who built them? Again, there is uncertainty. The park plaque says that they were the handiwork of the Hopewellian people who moved eastward into the area. However, there is no proof of this, and it could be that the local residents were just influenced by the Hopewell practices. And it would be nice if we knew the name of the culture that we call the Hopewell, since that is just the name of a researcher. One source said that the mounds here are the sole archaeological example of the Hopewellian characteristics in Minnesota. The Dakota, who were here when European settlers arrived, made use of the mounds for some burials. They may not have been the original builders. One of several sources on the matter include a note on an 1849 issue of the Pioneer Press, which states that the mounds are a subject of wonder and admiration. Their ancient and inscrutable origin baffle even conjecture. The present race of Indians know as little of them as ourselves. The truth is, we may never know who the mound builders were. It says, artifacts that were found included stone knives, copper axes, and a variety of carved pipes, pottery vessels, and ornaments made of copper and shell. And copper and shells are found throughout the mound builder sites throughout the whole country. Some items were made of material not available locally. There was a volcanic glass from Wyoming, and I find that very fascinating. Copper from Lake Superior area, and that comes from the northern peninsula of Michigan, I believe. Mica from the Appalachia, and marine shell from the saltwater oceans. This suggests the extensive trade network, and that is really key. They used the rivers, and this was simply a whole culture that lived all across the country that were connected. Sure seems to go against what we were taught in school about what existed in the United States before 1776. Now it says, we are also not sure who got buried there. Probably not everyone, or there would have been hundreds of mounds. And I'm going to be covering exactly how many mounds maybe there was in Minnesota total. Perhaps some leaders or prominent people. Several types of burials were discovered. Most were simple internments accompanied by mussel shells or projectile points. There were log tombs at the base of some of the mounds, and that seems to be spread out all over the country in these mounds, these log tombs, and they are associated with the original building of them. And that's the way it appears to me. And it says, 2 other containers contain 7-inch high, thin limestone slabs set upright. Human remains found there were accompanied by more elaborate grave offerings, including shells, perforated bear teeth, and a hammered sheet of copper. A hammered sheet of copper. These people were working the copper, and I think that provides a great answer to the copper country mystery. I don't think people were sailing here and setting up shop. That would have taken decades to do their mining and then traveling across the world. I think it was people who existed right here in the very ancient United States. They didn't have to go very far. It's the simplest and most common sense answer to that question. It says, only 4 complete skeletons have been found in Dayton's Bluff. On September 20th, 1895, city park workers raising mound number 8 to improve the view from the park road came upon what they called a gruesome find. After several tons of earth had been removed, the sets of bones were in the center and on the bottom of the burial mound. It says attitudes were changing by the 1980s, and this made for changes in the area around the Indian mounds. In 1981, the city removal of roads between the burial sites and the bluff were completed, improving the setting and the relationship of the landscape to the topography. Around the same time, the Dayton's Bluff Community Council led a successful effort to place decorative fences that still remain around the mounds to protect them from thoughtless visitors. And to protect them from thoughtless visitors, maybe you should have been protecting these from thoughtless pricks, thoughtless rich pricks who lived on Summit Avenue there in St. Paul, who had these ancient sacred mounds removed just so they could see the river better. Now, before I read about the mounds all over Minnesota, just want to show you a few pics. This is from 1909, I believe, Indian Mounds Park, St. Paul. There's a place near Comfrey, Minnesota called the Jeffers Petroglyphs, and turtle effigies are a common sight. Now here's a stone cairn from around Red Wing, Minnesota. Who built this for sure? Well, I don't know. And very close to the Minneapolis-St. Paul area is Hudson, Wisconsin. This is LIDAR imaging of a bluff area, and it seems to be ancient earthworks and mounds are found in this area. And I had one comment on this site, that mounds clearly detectable and other features here. Here's a pic, and this says Mound Park, Laurel, Minnesota. But a New York Times article says this, St. Paul, Minnesota, May 24th, 1882. A skull of heroic size and singular formation has been discovered among the relics of mound builders in the Red River Valley. The mound was 60 feet in diameter and 12 feet high. Near the center was found the bones of about a dozen men and women mixed with the bones of various animals. The skull in question was the only perfect one, and near it was found some abnormally large bones. The man who bore it was evidently a giant. A thorough investigation of the mound and its contents will be made by the Historical Society. So apparently this burial in this mound was pretty similar to the ones I talked about in West Virginia, where there was a single large person buried with about a dozen others around that person. But I find that pretty fascinating. Up in Minnesota, same reports. Here is the Grand Mound from near the Canadian border, near the Rainy River, and over 100 years ago, people used to take excursions down the Rainy River and picnic at this mound site. Today it is pretty much closed off to people, and what makes this mound really unique is going off the western side of it. There is a large tail coming off this mound, an earthwork that appears to be a tail of some sort. This is almost like a serpent mound in northern Minnesota, but this site is closed and vegetation has grown over the site and nobody knows about it. And here's a website I will leave the link to, but this has some pics of some historical areas in Minnesota. Here is the Indian Mound Park overlooking the Mississippi River in St. Paul. There is another view of it. That'll give you an idea of how this was perched up. And people coming up the river 1,000 or 2 years ago, those mounds would have been the first thing noticed. Here is the Grand Mound up by the Rainy River. That is a pretty mysterious, unknown site. Now here is a paper I found, and they used LIDAR to map burial mounds in 16 Minnesota counties. And let me just read here just briefly. Give you an overview of this work here. It says, the University of Iowa Office of the State Archaeologist employed light detection and ranging data to verify and improve the accuracy of mapping burial mounds for 16 Minnesota counties. The University of Iowa analyzed LIDAR data for all known mound sites within 16 counties, producing LIDAR images of the mounds and synthesizing data on land use, site condition, historic modern survey information, and other data for the mound sites. The project area includes 650 previously recorded mound sites and the documentation of 7,646 individual mounds. It says burial mounds are the most significant and endangered of all archaeological resources in Minnesota. They are a manifestation of a collective labor and spiritual belief systems that span much of eastern North America between 1000 BC and AD 1800. Almost 12,000 mounds are recorded in Minnesota, but thousands were undoubtedly destroyed without being recorded, and an unknown number remain to be discovered. Of the 11,868 recorded mounds, there is no reliable estimate of how many are still extant and what condition they are in. It says the present project employs 21st century technology to map mound sites, many of which were initially recorded by late 19th century archaeologists T.H. Lewis and J.V. Brower. And I mentioned that guy a couple years ago in videos on the excavation of the mounds in St. Paul, and I'm going to talk about that just briefly. It says, the field surveys of these two individuals laid the foundation for the study of prehistoric earthworks in Minnesota. The two surveyors recorded hundreds of mound sites, with Lewis in particular demonstrating a technological competence that is commendable even by modern standards. Now here is the map of mound sites in Minnesota. These are just mound sites, not just mounds, but there were thousands of them, and there are probably ones that weren't recorded and lost to history, but that gives you an idea. This is the Minnesota River right here, flowing down here, and it comes up and it joins with the Mississippi River, right, the Minneapolis-St. Paul area, the Twin Cities, but for sure the earliest structures in St. Paul were those mounds. And here is just a listing of all the mound sites and individual mounds, and it comes out to 7,646, at least that were noted. It says most of Lewis' maps were redrawn by Winchell in 1911, but Lewis was doing some excellent research. And who was Winchell? I believe he was the gentleman who was in charge of geology at the University of Minnesota, and I think he was the first man to look at the Kensington runestone, if I'm not mistaken. Now here is an example of Lewis's notes where he documents the mound sites, takes excellent notes, takes direction and angles and degrees, and seems to be a very excellent documenter of ancient mound sites. But here you get an example of Lewis's notes and his fieldwork. He has location, degrees, angles, and the mound sites documented very well, pretty meticulously. And it says this is the Foster Lake Mound Group. But here is a demonstration of the LIDAR, and then they do topographical mapping over the LIDAR images. But here the mounds are, right down here, probably along a waterway. Now here is one image I thought was really cool. A truncated pyramid. Seems it has angles and steps. And this isn't just a mound, and this was found near the Minnesota River, I think. Getting exact locations is a little frustrating here, but I found that fascinating. Now here they go over a little more detail, the counties and the number of sites and what was actually found here. But the total number, over 7,000. And they even go over the area based on kilometers and the recorded number of mounds per kilometer. This is a pretty detailed paper, and I will leave the link below. Now, I think I'm going to wrap this up here pretty quick, but I just want to read from a video I did a few years ago on what was found here in excavation when these mounds were raised to produce a better view of the river. Now, since I did that video, this website has been removed, but I can still read from here. It says, August 14th, 1882, on which was done necessary assistance on excavation, was made in mound number 1, which was 60 feet in diameter and 10 feet in height. Near the center, at a depth about 3 feet 4 inches, was a decayed skull. Directly beneath it, some 10 inches, was a second skull and a piece of partially decayed oak wood, nearly 2 feet in length and 5 inches in diameter. On the same level, 5 feet 8 inches east of the center, were 4 decayed skulls, all crushed together. About 1 foot farther to the east of these was the seventh skull, which proved to be the rare find. Indeed, I know of nothing similar ever having been found in the mounds or ancient graves. The facial bones of the skull in question had been covered with red clay, thus producing an image of the original face. Unfortunately, pressure of the earth around it had forced it somewhat to one side and out of shape, and a small portion of the clay covering of the lower jaw fell to pieces, thus exposing the bone and teeth. So we have what is essentially a Mayan death mask way up in Minnesota in the northern United States. Now the Mayans and the Aztecs cultures in Mesoamerica use death masks. And here it says, further notes, similar funerary clay masks have since been found at several other places in Minnesota, at the Steel Mound Group near Shakopee, Minnesota, and that is just southwest of the Twin Cities where Canterbury Downs Racetrack is. It says 2 burials had clay eye plugs thought to be made of bluish green Decorous shale. And also, it says a possible clay ochre mask was found at the Howard Lake Mounds near Forest Lake, Minnesota. And it also says near the Canadian border, the McKinsey Mound number 2, dated around 1200 AD. And that's a big question mark. He says that skulls were found that had clay eye plugs in the eye orbits and clay masks. Now, these death masks certainly resemble what the Mayans and people way down south were doing. Way up in Minnesota, they were doing the same thing. That needs to be explained. Now, also, in this area, what was found when they did the excavation: 3 stones in a triangular pattern with a fire built right in the middle. And this seemed to be a used ceremonial area. Now, what would 3 stones in a triangle with a fire in the middle represent? Well, that's simple. Now, here's Orion with Orion's belt up here. But these stars here, one right here, one right here, and one right here, these form the pyramid to the ancient Mayans. And right in the middle, the fuzzy smoke of creation, they called it, or the eye in the pyramid, as it would later be kind of evolve into pyramid, eye in the middle. But this was the Orion Nebula, the place of creation. And that's why in St. Paul, Minnesota, there was found a triangular stone pattern with a fire in the middle. But that'll give you a little history of Minnesota and the mound sites. Here is Minneapolis, St. Paul, where there was a whole bunch of mounds around the confluence of the Minnesota River and then the Mississippi River coming down. Up here on the border of Canada, the Rainy River, we have the Grand Mound, and that site should really be researched, and there should be archaeological work done there, because I think that holds some mysteries and some pretty cool finds up there. That seems to be an important site, and with that tail or serpent or whatever's coming off the back of that mound that has just been lost to history and lost to overgrowth, well, that should be uncovered and work should be done on it. The people in Minnesota closed off that site. Come on, really? Also, we have Pipestone, Minnesota in this area, and it seemed people traveled from great distances to gather stone materials for everyday needs, and also there was some earthworks there, a serpent. But that is a little look at the history of Minnesota, some Indian mounds. I could really babble for a long time on each of these sites, but I only have so much time. Hope you thought that was cool, and you all have a very nice day.